Hi everybody, welcome to this Maya tutorial. So today we're going to be looking at the Maya interface. So for most of you this will just be a recap. It might be a while since you've used the Maya interface, but I'm going to go through the basic layout of the Maya interface, as it's a very complicated interface. There's a lot of different functions. So we're going to be looking at the interface, navigation, and object manipulation. So by the time of this, you should be able to, by the time we finish this lesson, you should be able to demonstrate navigation and manipulation of a 3D scene. Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at the views. So the viewport here, this is where you see your actual 3D scene. So you can see here I've got a sphere and a cube. So this is actually where the 3D interface takes place. So you can see I've got my three axes, the X, Y, and Z. This is our 3D scene. Okay, at the very, very top here, your layout might be different to mine, but up here we have some different layouts. So I'm going to Maya Classic because this has just got a, a lot of the tools that we're going to be looking at. So if your interface gets muddled up a little bit, this is just a good way to reset your interface or to customize your interface. So at the top here, Maya Classic, and you'll just have the standard Maya Classic interface with all of the functions that we'll be looking at today. Okay, so on the left-hand menu here, we have some different view layouts. We have single view, which we're in at the moment, and we have four view, which you probably have as well. And you'll have a whole bunch of other views that I can't see because I've got a small screen resolution because I'm creating a YouTube video for this. So you'll have some different configurations as well. But the two main ones we're going to be using are these two, single view and four view. And you can use that, you can switch between that by tapping the space button, the space bar. So you just tap it really quickly. If you hold it down, that creates a different effect. So we just want to tap our space bar, and that'll go between our two different views. Okay, so these are all resizable, so I can change the size of these windows by dragging them in the usual Windows method. And I can choose a view and focus in on that one by tapping the space bar, as we said. And these are all different perspectives. So this one we're looking from the top, front, side, and from our 3D perspective view. Okay, so we want to learn how to navigate in these 3D space. So we're going to choose our perspective view and make that large by tapping the space bar. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is tumble. So if you hold down the Alt or Option key, so we're back on, I'm assuming they're back on Windows, but if you hold the Alt key and use your left mouse button, you'll be able to click and drag, and you'll tumble around around your scene. So you'll see three-dimensionally around your scene. See how I'm spinning this around? Good. Now, if I want to spin around a specific object, I can just click that object, tap the F key to focus on it, and then I can spin around that specific object. So by doing the same thing. See that? So now I can see just around this cube, or if I do want to do that with the sphere, tap F for focus, and do that around the sphere. So this is a useful way of looking around a specific object. So that's how you tumble. So Alt and left mouse button. So the next one we're going to look at is pan. So pan means move the scene left, right, up, down. So I can use the Alt key again, and now we need the middle mouse button, which on a typical mouse that will be just push in the mouse wheel, and now I can move the scene left to right, up and down. So I can get a bit of a better view on some objects, or I can move objects centrally or to the side. And the last two we're going to look at for this is zoom. So there's zoom and dolly, which are essentially very similar effects. So if I use Alt and left mouse button, that means I'm going to move the camera closer or further away. if I use the mouse wheel, I'm going to zoom in and out of my scene. So it's a bit like using the zoom control on your camera. So very similar effects, but they are slightly different. Okay, good. So now we're going to have a look at some of the different view modes. So if I press 1, if I choose my cube, press 1, that's the default view. That's seeing my mesh as it is. If I press 2, that's going to, actually I'll choose the cube, that'll be a better view. If I press 2, that's going to show my cube in smooth mode with the wireframe around it. So 1 is just the cube, and 2 is the cube in smooth mode with the wireframe, and 3 is just the smooth mode. So I can see that the cube has been smoothed out. Now, this is useful for modeling things that are going to be an organic shape. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I'll go back to 1. And if I press 4, that's going to show me the wireframe, so I can see the actual mesh of the objects. And if I press 5, that's going to bring me back to shaded view. So now I can see wireframe and shaded. There's also 6 and 7, which are showing the lights and the textures, which we don't have yet. Now down the bottom of the screen, we have our animation controls. So we have a time slider, and we have play and pause buttons, similar to what you'd see on a just a standard play control, like on YouTube, or if you've got a old DVD player, things like that. So these are kind of standard play controls, but there's a few extra ones in there as well. But essentially these are to control your time slider. See, so I can move the time slider back and forward. And I haven't set any changes yet, but this is for making animations. So I can use my time slider to make an animation. So you see here I've got a time slider going from 1 through to 120. So it's going to have 120 frames, and that's going to play through those frames. If I want to make an animation, all I need to do is set a keyframe by pressing S, and you can see that I've got a red line on the time slider. Then I go to another frame, so let's say 60. I move my object, which we haven't got to yet, and I press S, and then we can see that my object is animating. So I can use these play controls to control my animation. So we don't really need these at the moment, but that all of these controls in this set here are all for creating animations. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. I'm going to get rid of my keyframes there by clicking and deleting. Oops. Good. So now what we're going to do is have a look at the manipulation of our objects. So you can see here on the left-hand side, we've got our object menu. So we have a selection, so I can just use a pointer to select different objects. We're going to skip over these two for the meantime. We're going to move straight to the Move tool. So when I click on the Move tool, you can see I have these 3 arrows appear, and that lines up with the 3 axes. So I can move up and down, left and right, and forward and backward. I can also move in all directions at once by clicking the middle, or I can just click on these little squares here to choose 2 planes. So if I don't want to move my object up, I can use this to move the object on just 2 planes, and same with this one here. So it's the same as moving on this Y and X axis at the same time. So I've restricted to Y and X, and this one I've restricted to Z and X, so forward and sideways. The second menu item here is the rotate tool. So once again, I click on this, click on an object, and I have a very similar control here. Instead of arrows, I have these circular icons that I can use to rotate. So I can click on this. Oops. I might actually choose the cube because you can see a cube rotate more clearly. So I can rotate it on around the Z axis, or I can rotate it around the x-axis, or I can rotate it around the y-axis. So I can rotate it around all these axes, or I can just rotate it around all the axes at once. Oops. But that's not very useful. So we want to use, so it's more useful to have single axes at once, so you can make more accurate movements. Okay. And the third tool we're going to look at is the scale tool. So the scale tool looks very similar to the move tool, except instead of these little arrows, I have these little boxes. So what I use these for is for scaling up and down. So I can scale on the y-axis, on the x-axis, or on, if I rotate that around, the z-axis. Or I can do the same thing, use these to rotate, to scale on two axes at a time, see? Or the central one to rotate the entire object at once. So this one's more likely that you're going to use the central part of the tool, and that's because you'll want to scale things up as an entirety on this one. It's more likely you're going to want to scale things up on all axes at once, so you want to make things bigger or smaller. So have a go at rotating, moving, and scaling some objects. A little hint for this is that when we, before we were using the 1, 2, 3, and 4 keys to change our view, straight underneath that we have the Q, W, E, R keys. And they will, those keys are the shortcut to go to our manipulation tool. So if I press Q, I'll go to the arrow tool. As you can see here, Q. If I press W, that will take me to the move tool. If I press E, rotate, and R, scale. So those shortcut keys are just underneath your 1, 2, 3, 4 keys. So they're fairly handy and easy to remember if you think of them as being right next to your view tools. Okay, so we've had a look at this side menu and the bottom menu and the center here. And now what we want to have a look at is these two top menus, because there are a lot of functions here. So we have a menu at the top, and then we have a shelf, and then we have all of these menus down here. So there's a lot of functions here, but we don't really need to use all of these functions at once. So the main ones we're going to be looking at here is the poly modeling. So if I choose the shelf for poly modeling, that's for making objects like we've just been doing, like I did before. This menu here is more for things like saving, things like that. But what we have here is the context menu. So also the menu set menu. So if I click on that, that will change the menu based on what I want to do. So typically if I'm modeling, I want to choose modeling. And that will give me these mesh menus up here, which we're going to use a lot later on. But if, for example, I choose animation, that will give me a different set of menu items at the top here. So make sure that this is on modeling. This is a very important one. And that will give you your mesh menu items such as extrude and things that we're going to look into again later. Down here we have a polygon modeling shelf. And there's a lot of similarity on this shelf, for example. So in our mesh menu, in our create menu, we can create a polygon primitive sphere. And in this shelf here, we can do the same thing. So there's a lot of doubling up here. So don't get too intimidated by the amount of things in the menu. At the moment, we really just want to focus on polygon modeling and these mesh menus. So don't get too caught up with the menu being too complicated. We're not even going to have a look at a lot of these things. We're not even going to be looking at a lot of these functions. For example, Bitfrost, Mash, Motion Graphics, Bullet, Turtle. A lot of these menus we won't be using for the meantime, so don't let that worry too much. Here we have the snap settings, so we don't need to worry too much about that either. At the moment, that's just for making manipulation a bit more precise, so we can snap things together. Then here we have the rendering menu. So this is for actually committing our render, so committing our scene to an actual rendered scene, so a finalized looking scene. And then we don't need to worry about this at the moment either. At the top here we have our file menu, and this is a very standard file menu that you'll see in most programs where we create a new scene or we save, open scenes, import, things like that. And edit, the edit menu is once again very similar to an edit menu you usually have: undo, redo, cut, copy, paste, etc. So a lot of these menu items are very similar, so we don't need to worry too much about them at this stage. Okay, so the top menus, while complicated, we can simplify that by just looking at our polygon modeling and our polygon tools for the meantime for this duration of this course. Now on the right hand side we have some tabs here, and there's some similarities between these tabs, between especially the attribute editor and the channel box layer editor, but we're just going to have a little bit of a look at the attribute editor. Okay, good. So the attribute editor gives me the attributes for what I have selected. So for example, I have this box here, and I can have a look at all the different things that make up this box. So it's a very complicated thing. So very simple things like width, so I can change the width and height, and you'll notice that I've actually rotated this box, so it's the width and height and depth are going to be vary. And we also have subdivisions, so I can see how much mesh makes up this model. So we can see I've got changed the subdivisions, and that means I can give the model some more accuracy later on as we model in further classes. We can also see things like the material of the object. So we have some very basics, attributes about our material, so we can change the color of the object. And this is actually changing the color of all the objects at the moment. We can change a lot of the visual attributes of our object, as well as a whole bunch of more detailed attributes that we'll look at later. So if we have a look, so now if I click on my sphere, I can do the same thing. I can choose the size of it, and I can change the shading. I can change the way it looks. I can change how many subdivisions it has. You can see I've got a lot of mesh here. And on the side here, we have the channel box layer editor, which is very similar. It has some very similar attributes. So we can see here, for example, I can change these objects. I can change these details that we changed a moment ago through a different methodology. So we can just use the attribute editor for now. Once again, there is a lot of doubling up in Maya. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at is what's called the marking menu. So I'm going to close this attribute editor down. Oops. So to get our marking menu, what we do is right click on our object. Sorry, that's the one. If I right click on my object and I hold down the right mouse button, now that's going to bring up the menu called the marking menu. Now it's a whole bunch of attributes about our object. The three important ones we'll look at today are face, vertex, and edge. And these are the building blocks of our object. So if I choose vertex first, you can see here that's going to let me choose all of these little points that make up our object. So if I choose that point and I use my moving tool to move that point, you can see I'm manipulating this object. And if I go back to one view, because remember we pressed the 1, 2, and 3, we can see that I'm changing this object around in space. So I'm using the 1, 2, and 3, so I'm using the 1 key to make sure that this is the mesh and not the smooth mesh. So I can actually manipulate all of these vertexes, so these individual points of the object. See that? And the same with my box. I can choose right click, choose vertex, and these points come up and I can manipulate my box. And you can see here where I put the subdivision in, allows us to have extra vertexes so we can make more detailed changes to our object. Secondly, we can choose right click. So we hold down right mouse button and choose edge. Edge is the second building block of our object, which are, as very self-explanatory, the edges. You can see these edge lines here. So that's another way that we can manipulate our object through edges, and I can rotate those edges as well. And I can also scale those edges. So I can make them bigger or smaller, wider, and move and rotate. Okay, so I can choose them, and I can choose multiple edges by holding down the Shift key or the Control key. Oops, no, sorry, just Shift. So I can choose multiple edges, or I can select and drag a selection. So I can click and drag, and that's going to select everything that is everything that I've dragged over. So everything that was under the mouse becomes part of the selection. Okay, so thirdly, and we're not really making anything useful here, we're just having a look at our basic building blocks, is I can right click and choose face. Now face here, as you say, the faces. So these are the actual surface components of our object, and you can see that I've got lots of faces on this sphere and lots of faces on the cube. So I can rotate those around. I can rotate them, and I can also scale them. So these are our very basic building blocks for our My interface. And this is how we do our very basic object manipulation. Now lastly, what we need to do is right click and go back to object mode. So then I can move it around as an entire object again. So see that? I'm moving the object. But if I wanted to go back into edit some of the points, I right click, I choose vertex, edge, or face, and then I can move those objects around. Okay, so to conclude, today we've had a look at some of the different parts of the Maya interface. We've had a look at the view window here with our viewport where we can tap between the controls. We've had a look at our time controls. We've had a look at our playback and animation. We've had a look at our object manipulation, and we've had a look at the very detailed menus at the top and the attribute editor at the side. We can change our object view around by right-clicking and using the marking menu, and we can choose different components of each object, or we can choose the object as a whole. Okay, so that concludes this lesson. Thank you very much.